Okay, everybody welcome. Thank you for joining us at one of the more than 30 events at Digital Week. Thanks for coming out. Thank you to our panelists in advance. What we are going to be into today is a roundtable discussion. So we're really hoping for a kind of high-energy participatory conversation, starting with our outstanding panelists, many of them from home and at least one from far afield, Tara McPherson. And so what we'll do is we sort of teed up some talking points, and then we'll dive into the discussion along the way. Okay? So I'm going to begin by introducing our panelists, and we will dig in from there. So let me begin with our distinguished visitor from USC. Despite that fact, we're happy to have her here.
If it makes you feel any better, I've never been to a USC football game. So I don't really care. It actually makes us feel much better.
It's part of this, it's part of the scripted,
Okay, super cancer.
It's all good. So Tara is Associate Professor of Critical Studies at USC School of Cinematic Arts. She's a core faculty member of the IMAP program, USC's Innovative Practice-Based PhD, and also an affiliated faculty member in American Studies and the American Studies and Ethnicity Department. We've heard I won't read your whole biography, Tara. We've heard a number of presentations from Tara in the course of her visit today about the emerging modalities of digital scholarship, about the Scalar Project, about her journals and vectors, her work as a film critic, and is one of the great voices in the emerging field of digital humanities, which, as we know, is always, is a field which is full of creativity and also presents some of these core questions around credentialing scholarship, curating knowledge, distributing scholarly work product, and so forth. So, Tara, we're delighted to have you here on this roundtable today. Sitting next to me is Jim Collins, who's the department chair and professor of film, television, and theater here at Notre Dame. He's also concurrent in my home department of English. He writes about popular culture, about digital media culture, and teaches a number of very, very influential and popular courses here on campus, as well as a really fantastic experience, which is often called the boot camp in teaching film, or some version thereof, which involves both faculty and students, and sort of giving everyone a common vocabulary as how do I teach film to undergraduates. John Wang, right next to Jim, is Associate University Librarian here for Digital Access, Resources, and Information here at Hesburgh Libraries. John oversees 3 programs: Information Technology and Discovery Services, Resource Acquisitions and Delivery Services, and Digital Initiatives and Scholarship. And John has been one of our core partners in standing up Digital Week and all of our programs and events here in the Hesburgh Libraries. So John, thank you for your support in that area. Erin McLaughlin teaches multimedia and writing and rhetoric in our first-year writing program here at Notre Dame. Her PhD was recently, 2010, from Bowling Green State, and she works on and specializes in multimodal literacies. Her research and teaching interests explore the intersections between rhetorical theory, multimodality, identity, and community participation. Erin's done a lot of really important work on campus for helping our students to really understand the vocabularies of multimedia writing and then to produce their own work here at Notre Dame. And then finally at the end is Tim Flanagan, who I know in a couple of different capacities. He's not only our Associate General Counsel, where he works on things like IP and software license agreements and technology transfer, intellectual property issues, and all of that. He also shows me contracts which have clauses I don't like in them.
You're not the only one.
But Tim also teaches intellectual property law and sort of in the software practice area at our law school. And so Tim has a wide range of experiences, both from a practitioner standpoint, but also from a scholarly standpoint, in thinking about intellectual property, which is, as you know, an emerging and dynamic field, and not only in the world of software, but also in terms of all content as it is distributed throughout the various digital media ecosystems that we now inhabit and will continue to do so for some time. And Tim is also a double domer, I should say. He's both an undergraduate and a graduate.
I have been to USC football games, so.
So with
And you
that,
probably care if they win or lose.
with that, I will close the introductions, and I'm going to tee up our first question. and our speakers have 3 minutes each. And so here's your question, your pre-arranged question. I feel a little bit like Alex Trebek.
Is there prize money involved with this?
Maybe.
Jackpot.
You might get an iPad cover or something. Or a T-shirt.
Yeah, we have
Do you have any
T-shirts.
T-shirts? I mean, with prizes. Okay. Anyways, back to the serious business. From the perspective of your discipline or area of research, how have digital advances altered the field of scholarly communication? What are the benefits and what are the challenges? Anyone want to begin? I'll let you guys jump in. How has, within your discipline, how has digital technology, digital tools, platforms, distribution methods altered the field of scholarly communication? How does scholarly communication travel differently? What are the benefits? What are the challenges? I'm going to call in Jim. You can go first since you're close to me.
Well, my role in answering these questions, or as part of this team, is probably going to be, I'm the meta guy, all right? So in other words, I'm not going to be talking as much about the legality of all this. Tim's got that covered, I'm figuring. And others on the panel know far more about the actual tech aspects of this than I do. What I would like to begin by talking about is in terms of scholarly communication. For me, what's so interesting is the redefinition of what is the scholarly in digital communication. What does it mean to have an expertise about anything? I'll give you a specific example, just because I was talking with one of my students about this about an hour ago. He came in to ask me about a particular reference to another film, in a Tarantino film. And as I was explaining in detail, this was in a reference to this particular film noir, and this was like in Inglourious Basterds, and another student came by and said, why don't you just go to Tarantino Archives? Because it's got them all lined up there, all right? And so, in effect, when I used to teach something like Pulp Fiction, for instance, many, many years ago, all right, it was my job as the film scholar to tease out all the intertextual references, to provide the context, to put the film in a tradition, all right, and in fact to elevate the level of discourse to a certain level that wasn't just, why is the back of that guy's head why is the briefcase glowing? And I could say, that's a reference to Kiss Me Deadly, and they'd all go, wow, that's really cool. All right, but my point is that kind of knowledge is now readily accessible. All right, at which point, if something which we would otherwise think of as a kind of arcane knowledge, a kind of, I guess you could say, database. All right, it is called an archive. All right, what's my function then as the person who comes in as the scholar? All right, how does that change the relationship between the scholar and the person who may not consider themselves a scholar, but is nevertheless a fan, but not just a fan either, but somebody who, in effect, can speak with great authority. And I'm throwing out Tarantino as an example out there, but there are other examples, obviously, but this gets even more complicated. Jane Austen is a perfect example. It's about as far from Tarantino as I could possibly imagine. I gave a paper not too long ago about Jane Austen and the world building, and that term world building is something we talk about in transmediation. Karen will speak a little more about this than I do, but a lot of the conversation about transmediation has been in reference to, say, superheroes, and that because of Marvel Comics and DC Comics, there are conglomerate structures that allow for that transmediation. But I would be willing to argue there are as many, if not more, transmediated Jane Austen texts now that are in effect they're taking place all over the map, and not just within the context of a conglomerate structure. The writing of sequels, the writing of continuations, and then in effect I can think of those as a kind of spectrum. Yes, there are the fan books like Mr. Darcy Takes a Wife or something like that, and then there are the pornographic versions, and then there are even Mr. Darcy at Christmas time and all these kinds of things. But then when you got P.D. James writing Death Comes to Pemberley, who's a noted British author, it seems to me that kind of rewriting, who has an expertise, who can speak for Jane Austen up to and including who can take over her characters, but then most importantly, who can then comment critically on it, that, in effect, the table's been reset by that kind of visual communication. And where we fit as scholars within it is one of the things I continue to grapple with.
They're really interesting IP implications for some of the transmedia questions. I think things such as big question like who owns literary property, right? Is Jane Austen common property now? What happens when that common property starts to become remediated? And so do others have thought, Tara or Tim perhaps, Erin, John, any of you jump in on that? Either the thread on IP or the original prompt. What is scholarly practice now, perhaps?
Scholarly practice, you can take. That's not my world.
I feel like you probably, if you were there yesterday, already heard a lot of what I think about this, but I'll just try to kind of encapsulate a few things I see as possibilities and a few as challenges as based on the changes we're seeing. So I think one of the exciting things scholars have available to them now, if they work primarily in visual media, is the capacity to engage visual objects in a much richer way than simply in text. So, as I mentioned yesterday, as a film scholar, what happens to your kind of analysis or interpretation if the evidence that you're basing your claims on is available with your analysis? I think similar questions extend to scientists working with data sets, so that the claims you're making about a particular set of evidence, which is always open to interpretation, even in the sciences, right? A reader can then test your claims against the evidence at hand, available as an interactive or visible data or visualization or a film clip, depending on what your object is. And those kinds of attempts to think about how the relationship of analysis to evidence shifts have other implications. So what might the best form for a scholarly argument be? There are certain constraints of a journal article or a book. Some of those constraints are lovely affordances as well, but for some work, those are not the best format for what you might want to communicate. So, I'm very interested in what database or algorithmic structures allow for both authors and users and interacting with material differently. I think immersion offers us a unique set of possibilities now for new ways of knowing. I have a grad student who works on immersive journalism, where people wear headsets and interact with documentary footage, and that raises a host of legal and ethical questions, but creates some really compelling and interesting ways to imagine empathy differently. If you're immersed, say, one of her projects immerses the viewer at a food bank line that's run out of food, and the footage is real documentary footage, and you're interacting in that space in 3D, right? So I don't think as scholars we even begin to know how we'll grapple with issues like those, but we have new ways to think about the relationship of argument or content to form of delivery, right? And I imagine Erin has a lot to say about that as well.
Actually, yeah, I think that the advances in digital technology, it's very exciting for me because of how it both reinforces and problematizes a lot of key concepts in the field of rhetoric and composition. So we like to think of author and reader and purpose as being very, very tidy. The rhetorical triangle is just very tidy, and I think that digital culture reveals to us that these are the line between author and reader and designer and purpose, if they were ever tidy to begin with, which I think is highly questionable, are becoming all the more blurred as people are able to seamlessly be writers and designers and appropriate scholarship, appropriate texts, which reveals to us that text is not such a static entity, if it ever was a static entity to begin with, which again I don't think is really true, but it gives us comfort as scholars to think about text as being, static and not changing. So I think it's fascinating to teach composition and rhetoric in this cultural moment, especially as our technologies become more and more transparent. So it's fascinating to me. I just came from teaching 2 sections of multimedia writing and rhetoric. And at the beginning of every class, students are like, on their phones and they're commenting on things, and they've got Facebook feeds coming in and they're checking their email and they're responding, and then they'll put their stuff away and be like, technology doesn't have that much of an impact on my life. It doesn't really have much of an impact on my writing and reading practices. And I don't really think about, how literacy and rhetoric are, connected to the way I consume and interact with media. So that's something that is a perennial question for me as a scholar and a teacher, is how do I make visible, right, the way that this cultural context inevitably shapes their identity as scholars, as thinkers, as writers, as readers.
I'll jump in. You should never let the lawyer have either the first or the last word. So I'm going to jump in before you jump.
Let the librarian always have the
That's
last
right. We'll
word.
let the librarian have the last word.
All right.
You know, from an intellectual property standpoint, as it relates to both the advancement of technologies and scholarship, you know, I think a lot of us would look at the law oftentimes as a regime that puts pressure on us. It sets rules, it sets guidelines for how we do things, how we're supposed to act, how we're supposed to perform. And I'd say over the course of the last 15 years or so as an IP attorney, as I look at the progression of technology, oftentimes, and I'm sure we've all heard this, that the law sometimes lags behind. The law doesn't see technology in the light that it should be seen as of today. And I think in many ways that's true, although in many ways the law has been catching up. And part of the reason why I think the law has been catching up is because the new uses of technology in the academic sector have started to put pressure back on the law again. And so concepts which really had started to slip in many ways that were meant to promote academic uses of protected works like fair use. It's been very interesting over the course of the last 5 years to see really a resurgence or a revolution of fair use to come back into the question again. And the courts are recognizing the very important role that fair use plays for academics, for commentary, for bringing a transformed view of an existing work. Yeah, you used a very interesting phrase, the appropriation of information, the appropriation of someone else's work. And normally the IP lawyer would say appropriation, that sounds like reproduction, that sounds like stealing. But really we're looking at it in a very different way now. And technology has allowed us to do new and different things that we just couldn't do before. I look at the onset of text and data mining, analytics, big data, if you will. There are pressures being put on the law again when we look at this and say, how can we use these tools to extract new information to get more out of this world of scholarship that already exists? And I think fair use has been very well used in that regard to provide an argument that access, if we can get it to the information, we should be able to use materials in these ways. Now, the access piece that I mentioned, I think is one of the big challenges that still remains. The world is not only governed by copyright law, say what is the world governed by law at all, but not just copyright law, but there's been a commodification of information in a way so as to extract more value for copyright owners. And now getting access to information is more difficult than it used to be. So we're not just talking about, may I use that, would copyright law allow me to do that? Now we don't sell information anymore. We rent access to it. So you've all heard the travails of, oh, our license agreement doesn't allow us to do X. Copyright law may allow us to do X, but if we agree to do something else, now there's another legal pressure that's placed on us. And I think that's one of the challenges that we face is how can we lower these barriers to get access to employ these technologies in new ways in the new technological uses of scholarship.
Will you come be my university lawyer? Because I want one at my university who begins by talking about fair use and access as the starting point.
Yeah.
That's
Let's
not
see.
my university lawyer.
In January, it
so
looks a lot
you should
different
keep
in
Or maybe he's just doing that performatively for this audience.
Right, raise your hand if I've been a good fan of fair use. See, check it out. Check it out. Thank you.
I'll be happy to help Tim. Be happy to help broker Tim's visit in January. John.
Yeah, well, it's definitely good to wrap up this question. You know, as a library, we often engage in this knowledge creation in the labs, right? We're preservation, access, and delivery of services. And I do think the IT side advancement really given us this ubiquitous, unified delivery platform. And certainly it's a game changer in my point of view. So you think about in the print world, right? So the metadata about publications and the content themselves, books and journals, they're really living in two separate systems, right? And for faculty to do any research, you have to come in to use the catalog, and then you go into the tower to fetch a book, find a book, and you read. In this electronic world, even now in Notre Dame, look at our OneSearch tool. It's really a quasi type of tool. And, you can go there if anything exists in electronic format. You can just retrieve and deliver to you right at that moment. So I want to extend this to think about our university in general. Think about our course catalog, right? That's again, it's a catalog. Talking about teaching. Right now, they're in print, they're online, but you have to register, get into the classroom environment, and start really, receiving the knowledge. So there's a possibility. We can create MOOC classes and the short videos, and making them living in the same system as our registration system. So that's really a game changer. Students can definitely take class on their own terms, their own space, their own pace. So that's changing the way how university really deliver education. So that's my point of view in terms of the technological advancement for us. The second one, my background is really in the economics. So if you ask me about the change, what I would say is really the technology lowered the threshold of entering the market. So really echoing to Erin's point, so everyone now, they can be an author, they can be a creator of knowledge. And anyone can use the technology available and making their delivery of the content so superb to anyone else, right? So really, I think at this point, we're really facing this sort of competition and trying to figure out, what would be the best way to continue to advance our scholarship. There's really a lot of schools made available for us. So that's sort of the two point I want to share with the audience here. So some of the challenges for the library and IT point of view. First one is really the preservation, right? So you look at the books around you; those are really preserved so well throughout generations, and everything living in electronic format, they can just disappear just like that, right? So for the library professional who had to think about, so how to make sure Jim's and Tim's or Tara and Erin's scholarship going to carry on, 50 years, 100 years. But that's not something usually scholars are thinking about. But that's really critical for our posterity, continue to have an access to that information. I think the second challenge for us is really the discoverability, right? So in my point of view, yes, you got a lot of content published online, but discover those quality contents are difficult. So go back to Tara's keynote talk yesterday. So if you're not lucky enough to show up on Google's first page, search page, you're out of luck, right? Maybe you have very high quality content, but if Google cannot index it, cannot find you, you're really out of reach from many exactly. So I think those are the challenges for us and for the library to think about how really helping to raise the visibility of our scholarship to the general public. So those are the 2 points I want to talk about.
Just to riff on a couple of the threads I've heard before we go to our next question, I wonder if the panelists would care to very briefly reflect on a style or mode of scholarly commentary. Leave aside platforms, the technology that enables the commentary, but either the emerging or the attractive styles or modes of scholarly commentary that they see as replicable, engaging, and important as having emerged in the past few years, right? So some of the styles of scholarly conversation, the footnoted article with showing your work and all of the rest, the book, the other sort of legible forms of scholarly practice. That's one, and that has a certain sort of distinctive house style, right? It's very cautious, it's very sort of documental, sort of primary source oriented in the humanities and so forth. So are there other versions of style or modes of expression that are unrelated to the platforms themselves? I know that's sort of a hard thing to disaggregate, that you would like to flag for us and saying, we should be doing more of this. Less highly annotated articles, more of this. Less of this, more of this, etc. Just as a talking point.
I don't know if I'd say we should, do more of this and less of that.
Okay.
I never want to kind of kind of present things in either or terms right now. I think the moment is more interesting in both and registers. But a couple of interesting things I've seen develop in fields that I work in recently are new curatorial practices that scholars undertake. So in the past, scholars might have brought together a collection of some kind in order to become the scaffold or substrate to their book or article, but scholars are more and more, kind of sharing those curated collections as scholarly practice in their own right in fields beyond like art history where it might have been acceptable before. So aggregating, filtering, sorting materials to make them more findable, discoverable, more richly annotated, I think is a kind of emerging practice that technologies can sort of support and grow. In the very specific fields I work in and related fields like anthropology and even in performance and religion, the video essay has recently emerged as a fairly powerful communication tool. And that had a brief moment in the 60s and 70s already. All of these forms have histories, but the sharing of those is made much easier by kind of the network systems we work with. So the professional society Jim and I belong to, the Society for Cinema and Media Studies, has decided to add now to its flagship journal a video essay extension, right? So, and learning to write a video essay is not trivial. They're not, you can't just make a video essay well because YouTube exists, right? So there's new pedagogical demands placed on that.
And there's some really nice transference sometimes when I taught video essays and multimodal essays, in that students talk about the things I want them to talk about with their regular old MLA formatted research paper, but they tend to be more excited about talking about those rhetorical choices when they're working with media. So it becomes a really nice teachable moment for me to intervene and say, okay, you're obsessing over what sequence of images you're going to use to open this essay that's going to draw your readers in and foreground the important themes. Have you had that same conversation about your research paper that starts with, in today's society, technology is everywhere? Let's just go ahead and delete that. Yeah. But kind of building off of that, and the question about genres we need to kind of pay attention to. About a year ago, I started assigning TED Talks as the final project in my course. And I really like it because it gives an opportunity to talk about this genre, which is a public, this is a kind of popular genre for knowledge distribution. And we can talk about what is this symptomatic of, right? And what are the limitations in terms of everything that we've been talking about, because they're coming out of the research paper, and here are some sort of like benchmarks and hallmarks of good research. Where do we fit a TED Talk into that? What can you do with a TED Talk that you can't do with a research paper? What can you not do with a TED Talk that you can do with a traditional, kind of more scholarly traditional approach to scholarship? And I think that it's okay to problematize these genres even as we're paying attention to them and figuring out, again, what do we need to revise maybe about the way we're conceptualizing knowledge production, and why the MLA formatted, research paper. What is it that is valuable about that? And why are TED Talks so popular? And what is maybe valuable about this genre? What do we as scholars need to pay attention to, as well as, of course, the limitations of which there are many in that particular genre. So.
I think there's so many variety of publishing platform we can use to publishing scholarship. I mean, you can even using Wikipedia, in my point of view, right? But the point is, I think for our academics, how we validate the quality of the alternative publishing platform, or the quality or the content published on top of that. I think that's really a different question, perhaps. Yeah, certainly there are a lot of styles you can use.
Coming back to your question, I don't know if I can really disaggregate this from platform, but what I was thinking about, I actually began to think about this in terms of the question that we were provided with in terms of the opportunities and implications for scholarly discourse. And I got to thinking about it in terms of First, one of my colleagues, Christine Becker, has a blog. It's called News for TV Majors. And it's become phenomenally popular within the world of SCMS. And she has a degree of visibility in the field, even though she has published wonderful books and all that. Her visibility in the field really depends to a very great extent on that blog. Now, as her department chair, if she'd come to me with that idea when she was pre-tenure, I probably would have said, well, don't you want to put that same kind of thing into a top-tier publication or something like that? Post-tenure, given the new rules of the game, as it were, in terms of how important she is in the field, I would be hard-pressed to say that a second or third book at this stage in her career would have given her the same degree of visibility as that blog. Then that led me to think about how the trajectory of media studies may well have changed had people had blogs, say back in the 1970s. For instance, if Laura Mulvey had written Visual Pleasure Narrative Cinema as a blog, and Tanya Modulewski could have responded the next week, and Linda Lane could have responded the next week, you really begin to
Feminist
wonder.
film theory would have happened in 2 years.
But what I mean is, because in effect people did respond to each other, but it was the next year in a different journal. And in effect, the value of that kind of scholarly exchange is that it still is something that gets you tenure. It's still something that fits within the rubrics. On the other hand, I think we have to talk about not just in terms of the spaces of academic discourses, but also the temporality of discourses. Does it change scholarly exchange if it becomes closer to a conversation than something that takes years to, in effect, happen in the publication process? I mean, my last book sat at Duke University Press for almost 2 years, and I was at a point where I was ready to take out chapters and attach them to burning arrows and shoot them in the air. Just anything to get it out there, all right? And you really began to think seriously about whether this was a grave mistake, Should it have just been a series of blogs? Because to come back to that point then, I mean, in terms of the compression, the temporal compression, I think can lead to a kind of rhetorical sophistication that in effect, rhetorical sophistication used to be writing a well-polished essay. Is that the best kind of rhetorical sophistication that the field needs right now? Do we need to kind of rethink what the rhetorical exchange would be about?
Can I push on that, Jim? Because it's really interesting and potentially controversial point to say that higher velocity conversation and exchange fosters more rhetorical discipline. I mean,
well, this is really quick because obviously,
the
velocity. Obviously, I mean, people could shoot from the hip.
Right, that's the obvious reflexive answer.
Yeah, reflexive answer is going to shoot from the hip, and it's not going to, have everything's not going to be scaffolded with footnotes and that kind of thing. All right, I'm not really. I mean, yesterday, when I was asking Tara about the kind of either/or question, she said, "Well, why can't it be both and?" And it seems to me that the both and answer is appropriate here as well. Because I think if we, really do think in terms of scholarly discourse only as that which comes, scaffolded by footnotes, it is going to slow down the very field in which we are now talking, all right, which is digital communication. And to think about and write about digital communication in decidedly pre-digital forms, it seems to me to leave out the question as to whether velocity in some instances might be absolutely essential.
I mean, at the back end, of course, is the scholarly apparatus that you need, to show your work, as it were.
Sure.
Right? I mean, and so that then becomes, if you're separating out those, right, so that you've got and there are plenty of, models for this in other disciplines, right, where you've got your, bibliographical essay as an enterprise, as opposed to the highly scaffolded, interpretive article and so forth, with lots and lots of footnotes. And I think that's actually not a bad model for us to think about in terms of what we do to make legible some of the new and emerging practices and styles and modes within digital native scholarship. So also, by the way, there's going to be a shout out for the more traditional sort of set of research questions, which are important for things like libraries as far as curators of information.
Well, that's why when you said take this away from the platform, Elliott, I think there's a way to flip that too. Is it's like platform as scholarly communication itself. And the tech transfer hat comes on, and I'll give you the plug for the Shakespeare app. That's Elliott's. It's a new way of creating that conversation, right? And bringing that together in any form that you want, from traditional scholarship, immediately linked and overlapped with the immediate communication. And that's something that didn't exist And so it's the development of the new platform is actually advancing the scholarly conversation as well. And so I don't think you just leave platform out of it as well.
Now I want him to be my provost, not just my provost. We need a new provost. Ours is going to Cornell.
You still can't have him.
Thank you for the plug, too. But yeah, I mean, indeed, I mean, you know, I actually, and I think, you know, Tara and Erin and John, I mean, everybody, I think will say how difficult it is to separate out the platform from the style of content, the modalities of communication. And the platform itself is, I agree, is and ought to be understood as a primary scholarly work product. Right? So, I mean, that's a very important point. I mean, just, I'm going to go back to our sort of flow for a moment. So one of the questions that we teed up for our panel here was to ask them to think about which institutions were the key players in the new knowledge economy. What roles do academics enjoy in the new knowledge economy? What roles should librarians, publishers, both for-profit and university presses play in the new knowledge economy? Right? And there's a lot of potential institutional players, potentially some individual players, but there's a lot of potentially powerful institutional players in this space. Insofar as information flows through broadband networks and so on, we can already think about some of the key players, either broadband service providers like the Comcasts and the server farms and all the rest. So there's the infrastructural play. I'll put that on the table. You guys want to log in your sense of who the institutional players are and how academics ought to intersect with those players, those factors.
Maybe I will go first on one. I'll kind of jump in. So, Jim, when you mentioned the frustration that you had, we'll leave the name out of it, with a university press, because I think we have the same frustration at university presses, but you want to fire the flaming chapter. I think we're witnessing, because of the new technological changes, a real sea change in not only how we deliver things, but whose rights ought to be involved in what. Because the model has changed so much. It used to be, well, we have to put it out in print, so it's got to be in paper. It's expensive to bind paper books together and keep an inventory on hand and do distribution, all this. And in exchange for that difficulty, why don't you give me all the rights in it and I'll give you something back. And we're really seeing a change now with respect to how we deliver information, the ease of digital delivery, that whole paradigm changes. And I think it's incumbent on our faculty and our librarians to really start paying attention to how do we retain some sort of access to that information that we're either generating or promoting as a library, and start to change the dialogue with publishers, with the publishing houses. What rights should be retained? What rights should an institution retain? The repository rights, as Eric is here, the repository rights within an institution. What ought we be able to display of our own scholarship? And then there are other pressures. This is another place where the law is coming into play in fairly recent times. Federal grant recipients, almost across the board. I know now National Institutes of Health is the flagship for this, but it's coming to all grant funding agencies, that there be open access to publicly funded work. And this is a real shift from the way publication has happened in the past, and it's something that we need to accommodate, and it's a good thing. This is something that gets that information out there. You know, there's a room for leveraging the economic equation with embargoes, but ultimately the public gets that information back. And that's something that I think all the players here, the producers, the consumers, and the distributors of the information need to really pay attention to what are we trying to accomplish. And it's not just about cornering the market on that information.
I mean, I would like to see the porousness between those different key players and what have formerly been silos, the porousness increase. So when John mentioned that, scholars did their research, but they didn't think much about how the archival objects that enabled that research was cataloged or housed unless they couldn't find it. And they certainly didn't think about how the book was going to physically be made and then who would steward it afterward, right? I think everyone within that ecosystem needs to understand more about what the other parts of the ecosystem are and put pressure on the places where we can, right? So, right now the key player that clogs up a lot of this system is, you heard me already say, is Elsevier, and we should just say no to that, right? We shouldn't do that anymore. We should not sell, as authors, we should understand that we have the right to retain copyright on the material we produce, and we should not sign that away to publishers. There's a librarian at the University of Minnesota who runs brilliant workshops for faculty, showing you how to mark up the contracts you habitually sign with your journal or book editor. And most presses will give those things back to you if you ask for them, with some small restrictions. I have learned the hard way recently that Harvard will not, but they'll be the last to fall, right? So we need to really think about how this kind of more open system can thrive and put pressure on the players who block that kind of circulation of information in real ways, right? So, and I think a key player that Erin mentioned that we need to think more about is audiences for our work, and that those audiences, and the way Jim suggested, could be much broader than the audiences for our work have often been, as your app illustrates as well, right?
Yeah, there does seem to be an opportunity, at least, for a greater degree of public intellectualism. I think that that's an exciting possibility of digital culture, where we can keep blogs and publish ideas that we have, self-publish. The gatekeeping aspect of it is still there in terms of I need to go through this journal and publish my scholarly article. But in terms of performing your scholarship and performing these ideas and making them accessible to a more general audience, that seems to me to be much more possible now than it was, maybe 50 years ago, maybe even less time than that. But I'm also kind of interested in how kind of private sector Googles and Facebooks and whatnot are also the campus just went Google, right? How are you all liking your Google Mail? Doing okay?
Don't ask.
So, and that's a consideration that I think we have to think about is we're talking about who within the academy is shaping the future of scholarship and shaping epistemology, but there does seem to be, we're continuing to rely very heavily on these corporations who put pressure on us in various ways and offer services that are very attractive and hopefully make our lives easier. And so how much impact does that have on how we produce our knowledge, how we do our scholarship? Do we exist outside of a Google search, as scholars? So, that's a question that I think we have to return to as well.
Well, the way I see it, I think probably at this moment, the key players are still the key players, But I would think about the university or the value or the knowledge creation as a value chain, who actually playing a key role in on those value chain. I think increasingly, if you're talking about electronic world, I do think we have to rethink about the certain roles publishers are playing right now. I think as a university, as an identity or entity, we outsourced the publishing to the publishers before, right? Which was a pretty good decision back then. We had someone to facilitate the network, the peer review, the assess the quality of the publication, and now they produce them, they distribute them, and working with libraries and getting those books to the hands of readers and students and scholars. But now you look at that equation, that outsourcing become very expensive, right? And from a library point of view, we're licensing. We are not even owning the content. We're paying millions of dollars annually, and there's an inflation cost to us continue to keep up that outsourcing sort of model, right? But if you really look at the technology point of view, from the technology point of view, the publishing workflow is really have very low entry points. And I think for the university to take that on, it's very easily. But if you look at the value chain, who owns that content? It's really the university, the faculty members owns that. So we could actually really get an army of high quality reviewers to really assess the knowledge without really paying or outsource that part to other people. I do think the play really starts changing right now. So we're in conversation trying to understand more about the publishing and how I think as a university how we can actually play in a role in this, right? So I think you could think about a story from the IT sector, like Dell computers, right? So before they're all modularized component, have chips. They outsource into Intel and hard drive to many of the manufacturers. But they're really coming together to do the packaging of the laptop with that desktop computers. The same thing the publisher is doing for the academy, right? They're packaging it, they're reselling it. But what Dell made a mistake was they start outsourcing all this to the competitor, to ASUS in Taiwan. And gradually they're actually losing that. Now they're basically marginalized as a brand. There are so many other entities in the market to compete. So I think as a university, we should maybe start thinking about the value what university can offer, who owns the intellectual property, and how we actually advance the scholarship. So in my point of view, I think the current publishing model is really start preventing us moving forward.
It seems I'm really impressed by what everyone has said up to this point, and I'd like to add just one piece to this. And we're going to talk about who the key players are in terms of who is going to have control of different archives, different types of archives. All right, there's the archive, that academics and librarians, those kinds of archives. All right, there are the commercial archives like iTunes and Amazon. All right. There are the vernacular archives that Tara was referring to yesterday, like YouTube and Instagram. But then there are also the personal archives. And anybody who's got one of these has an archive.
Yeah.
And they walk around with it all the time. All right, as Steve Johnson said a long time ago, we're all curators now. And if we're going to talk about how we engage in a curatorial activity on a regular basis, just by going through our music files, our ebooks, our photographs, all right, there is a kind of curatorial function there, which I don't think we can write out of the equation. All right, I'm especially concerned with these, as I'm teaching a course on digital devices right now. But yesterday we were talking about the curatorial function in class, and by the time we got to the end of the discussion, it was clear that just in terms of thinking about the device as a camera, as an image capture technology, all right, the curatorial work that they all my students engage in on a regular basis, even though they don't refer to it as curatorial work, we were able to identify an acquisition phase, an indexing phase, and then display.
Yeah.
And that those are all interconnected for librarians, they're interconnected for scholars, but they're also interconnected for anybody who's got a stack, has put up a pile of photographs in their device. And it seems to be for us to be able to talk about who the knowledge brokers are going to be, they've got to be part of that conversation, because it is about redefining what the curatorial work is. We're all curators of the written word, but we're not the only curators of the written word.
So, I'm going to actually comment. One of the prompts that I give to my students when I teach First Amendment and freedom of expression in the digital age is the question: where is the public forum? Right? Where is the public forum right now? Where is the public square in which we deliberate about ideas of right, social order, justice, politics, et cetera, et cetera? And the answer we eventually get to is it's on servers, it is on wireless signals, it is primarily digitally mediated. And that fact has profound impacts on the way in which we form opinions, we think about public participation, we think about decision making, and so forth. The reason I mention that is that to riff on Tara's point earlier, there are indeed blocking structures or structures which exist to monetize IP or access to information and so on. And insofar as we in the university believe that part of our mission is to create and distribute new knowledge, I would say that our practices ought to be informed by analogical reasoning, what we can do and offer to the public, the idea of the public forum, i.e. that if access to information we believe is something like a human right, then our relationship with vendors of services, whether they be Google or Elsevier or Pearson or Luminary or whomever, our relationship should be informed by that fundamental sense that access to information is paramount, first of all, right? And that we will negotiate with vendors, parties, etc., from a position of valuing access to information rather than letting somebody own the tubes through which we speak to each other. This is what I would say. And so I believe that the university and the academy can provide an analogical and a model that we can use by analogy for informing a more robust conversation around access to information in the public forum through things like fiber to the home system, so that everyone has access to the pipelines through which information flows, right? And then you choose to opt into the services that you wish to purchase if you like, but getting onto the internet is not something that you need to pay Comcast a premium for example. So I would want to put in play that sense that what we do can be resonant and can be a model for navigating the knowledge economy that can then cross over and have great benefits for the public. Question 3, scholarly publishing. Where's scholarly publishing going? Specifically, book publishing, scholarly publishing, and the question that we cracked into a little bit yesterday, in what ways do these new and emerging modalities of scholarly publishing, scholarly communication, platforms, etc., challenge or put pressure on existing forms of peer review, knowledge authentication, professional standing, and so forth, right? It's a perpetual question that tenure promotion committees confront. How do I certify this new object, which I don't recognize because it's not an article with footnotes, etc.
I think that, I mean, in my field, there are several journals that are very friendly to multimodal text, so Computers and Composition Online and Kairos. And one thing that I find really interesting looking at those journals is something that I think about now that I'm the editor of Fresh Writing, which is brand new as a web text this year and is fraught with all sorts of questions related to the things we're talking about today. But a question, shout out to Lori McGowan in the audience, that came up as we were developing Fresh Writing with the web developers here in Hesburgh was, how much do we need to borrow from print-based conventions? And it's hard to think outside of print, even if we have all of these opportunities to present scholarship in a different kind of way. We seem to just, we can't shake ourselves out of those conventions of print, and so in the end, it's very print-like. And I think that even these scholarly journals, you know, they explore dimensions of textuality and what does scholarship look like, what does a piece of scholarly multimedia look like, but there are still all of these print-based conventions that that we can't seem to let go of as scholars, and so that's just a question that I've been thinking a lot about lately. In the Scalar workshop yesterday too, where it's just sort of like, here are my chapters for my book project.
Even if we call them pads, people still think they're chapters.
Exactly,
Right?
exactly.
So
You could call them anything you wanted, but we like to, you know, have those print-based conventions.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think, you know, Eric also pointed out one of the huge liabilities to boring digital scholarship in the Q&A at yesterday's talk, and that's durability and preservation of digital objects, right? You know, they will disappear, right? Probably much more quickly than, you know, any of these books, which I venture are probably some of them quite old in the room surrounding us, right? Right. The digital objects are less durable. I mean, they have different affordances. So thinking about what the trade-off is between certain other experiences you might have with digital works, including broader audience, I think, right? That you exchange for certain more secure ideas around durability and sustainability, right? That's a trade-off. I think for the other question on accreditation, apparently we should clone Jim, because to hear a department chair already thoughtfully reflecting on the value of the public scholarship one of his more junior colleagues is producing versus a monograph for 400 people warms my heart, right? I think that kind of attitude shift is slowly becoming more prominent and will help, kind of ease some of the, tension around how we evaluate digital work.
I think it might actually ease some of the things that would concern me a little bit too. In a very real sense, I'm an outsider to scholarly communications. I help support it, but I don't necessarily do it. But as I notice, there's so much pressure to get scholarship out, and the new channels of communication that have arisen can be problematic. Pay to publish is one, which has arisen, and it may not be a new concept, but I think the pressure to continue to pump out the scholarship promotes that sort of thing, and has a potential to both, I think, negatively impact the scholar and also call into question the validity of that peer review. What does it mean to pump that out? So when we talk about being able to better understand the scholarship itself and and how we communicate it, that starts to take some of that pressure back off of, well, I just have to get it published. It's got to get into a journal and get a site, whatever that means. So I think that's a very helpful thing, and I hope that that's a trend.
So the way I think about it is really, it's not more about technology. It's really about the way how we evaluate the quality, right, of scholarship. And I do think the existing players in the market, they really start already building the brand of it. So if you talk about Harvard Review or some other publisher's name, people, they shorthand them for quality. That's why our promotion and tenure, workflow, they really go where you're publishing your work. So let's say if Tara or Tim publishing, let's say a Wikipedia article, right, on digital cultures. So that was translated into 25 languages: Chinese, English, Japanese, and you have a global reach of your Wikipedia article. And there are many people, or high schooler, they cite that piece, and or a YouTube video. And how are you going to justify the quality, to your CAP committee and make sure that's a quality piece of work, right? Versus you can having the same article publishing on Harvard Review or some other places, PMLA, and they probably give a different weight on the publishing. I think one way we're fighting is really a perception about quality and the brand of existing players in place. So I do think from the library point of view, if we're more publishing in digital, so one of the challenges for us is really trying to managing the identity piece, right? So I think Jim is a really good example. Jim Collins, the famous author for From the Good to the Great, right?
Yeah, digital.
So I mean, myself is the same problem. You Google your own names. There are like maybe 25,000 or even close to 1 million people sharing the same name. And as a librarian, how we can differentiate this Jim is different than the other Jim, right? So I can really attribute the right scholarship to the right person. So in the print world, it's perfect. We have librarians, we have our catalogers to do the authority control. But now in digital format, it's so very hard to do, right? So that's one of the challenges our libraries are facing and trying to managing on behalf of our academy. Make sure Jim got his credit, and the other Jim got his credit too. So.
Thanks, I'm glad you're working on that.
So
Did you send me his royalties?
We'll check.
It's a question of values, then,
Exactly,
right?
it's really a question of
Do we
values.
value the reach?
Right.
Do we value the conversation,
Uh-huh.
right? That emerges as a
Exactly.
result of the
Yeah.
publication. And that, to me, clarifying our values does not seem to me to be an unproductive conversation to have, right? But we seem to be having it more in response to shifts in publishing practice. What is it that we value so much about an article in PMLA versus a self-published blog?
I mean, if you think about, I'm sorry, if you think about the question that you just teed up, one of the things that you can look at is impact, right? So an article in PMLA, which is very prestigious from a certain point of view, may be read by 3 or 4 people who then cite it and so on, but another form of communication may have transformative impact on 5 or 6, the scholarship of 500 or 600 or 1,000 or 2,000 people. And I think that one of the things that's incumbent on us is to responsibly and ethically document impact, that being citation counters. And so as to say, this scholarly work product, in whatever form it may be, had impact on all of these readers in some form, whether it created a new research agenda or there were other forms of scholarship that were built on it, et cetera, et cetera. And that gives another sort of access to thinking about valuation and prestige and all of the ways in which we credential information goods. Right? And so I would put that on the table as something we ought to think about, but without going down the version of impact citation, sort of citation counting that happens in the law scholarship world, in which people dutifully cite the articles they think are the most important because they've often been cited. It's the Googleization, I mean, sort of algorithmic, recursiveness. That I think is something you can probably counsel people against. But I do think that tracking or in some fundamental way looking at impact, which is then technology can help surface that for us, is something that I think we ought to put into our toolkit.
And it's like, to pick up on credentialing, I think that's why I asked the question, Tara, that I did yesterday, in terms of what are the vectors of vectors, because, I mean, I thought it went into being really almost schizophrenic about this issue, because on the one hand, as a department chair, I know that if I have one of my junior untenured faculty who's going to be coming up for tenure, to play by the rules of that game, I have to make sure that they have publications in the top tier journals and presses and all of that. And if I make a pitch to my dean to take that case on to the provost for tenure, and I say, well, she's got a lot of swell blogs, but no real what you'd call publications, he's going to laugh at my face.
Yeah.
And so I feel an obligation, professional obligation, to my junior faculty to, in effect, be able to observe the rules of that game. On the other hand, as somebody who writes about e-readers a fair amount, all right, one of the things that I think is profoundly wrong, for instance, about e-readers, is that it leads to a kind of promiscuous reading. Nicholas Carr's argument, for instance, in his essay, Very Like a Book, that every e-book is already a website, and therefore that precludes deep reading. Well, I think that's fundamentally wrong,
Yeah.
all right? Because we can think about different kinds of deep reading or expansive reading, and if that reading takes you somewhere else and then takes you somewhere else, I mean, and then on that same screen where you're reading that book, that same screen is also is a page, it's a screen, it's an image capture technology, the very multifunctionality of the e-reader, because he talks about e-books, but we have to talk about the e-reader, which is always already a library, all right, which is a multifunctional library. It seems to me that to think about the future of reading within that context, only in terms of whether it allows for traditional deep reading or not, is a profound mistake. So what I worry about is how do we go in that direction and begin to establish the kind of scholarly paradigms where we can begin to have a conversation about that kind of reading in a multifunctional screen culture, all right? At the same time, knowing that until a lot of the academy gets to that point, we're still going to have to be playing by the rules of a game that many of us might think are antiquated, but are nevertheless going to get people jobs that we care a great deal about.
So I'm going to, in order for us to get to this question, I'm going to ask the panelists each to give us a list with no commentary of the skills that they regard as essential for new knowledge workers in the new knowledge economy. Right? And then we will dive into Q&A. This is for all discussion. So, Anyone want to give us a lightly annotated list of the skills they think are essential for those entering the new knowledge economy, whether they be our PhDs or undergraduate students, our colleagues, etc.?
Say critical media literacy and awareness of intellectual property.
You stole mine.
Sorry.
Should you go first?
I would echo literacy, and I would think of it in a phrase I love from Dan Cohen, where he talks about right-sizing scholarship, like knowing what size the scholarly thing you want to communicate is and what the best form to do that in is. I think skills at filtering, selection, and synthesis, particularly critical synthesis, collaboration, which might be the most important one, and maybe the hardest one to eke out of scholars, intellectual generosity. Yeah.
I think a willingness to learn new tricks. It's very easy to get pulled back into, as you said, Jim, the old way, because it can get you the job. You have to know that and be accepting of the new way. So I think that's important, which is really another way to say it, be flexible and agile.
Yeah, I still think problem solving, sort of analytical skills is important. And I echo to what Tara is saying. I think that now it's hard to have one person to embody all the skills that you need. So I really need to understanding the team working environment, collaborate with others with other domain expertise. And I think the game is really trying to disseminate and distribute your scholarship faster and quicker, and to present it in a more variable ways, right? So really, I think the collaboration is very, very important.
Just to reiterate, to echo what many of you have already said, I think it's the critical digital literacy. And it would be very easy to say, all right, new skills, search and filter. But Matt Hills is a British media scholar, wrote a fascinating essay on BBC Sherlock. And he said that what's fascinating about, what's compelling about him is that this Sherlock doesn't, his genius does not reside in his brain attic as much as in his ability to search and filter. That he can use the same devices that the rest of us use, all right? And therefore, the appeal of the new Sherlock might have a certain amount to do with Benedict Cumberbatch, but nevertheless, it's somebody that, in effect, is thinking in a way that we think. He uses those same skills, all right? But even to, in effect, set that up in terms of search and filter versus brain attic, and how that, what does that mean in terms of, what are the ramifications for that of not only the accumulation of knowledge, but the valuation of knowledge. What is important to remember and how do we access it, all right? That involves critical media literacy. And what I've been struck by in teaching this digital devices course is that I've had students coming up to me outside of class in the first few weeks of class saying, in the same way that once upon a time when I was teaching intro to film analysis classes, students would come up to me and say, wow, I didn't know you could possibly get that much out of the film. Well, I'm now getting the same responses from my students saying, I didn't know you could get that much out of this. And that to me, I mean, even in the report that came out last summer, Heart of the Matter, all right? I mean, the Heart of the Matter report talks about digital education only in terms of the instrumentalization of digital learning. There was no sense at all that a critical screen literacy was going to be part of the education of the future. And that to me is crucial.
So I was getting one factor, which is design. And that is to say, under the sign of which user experience, user interface, information and knowledge design. I think that's important is that as scholars, we're really good at thinking about what our utterance, our new communication, our vision, our interpretation may be. We also ought to attend to questions of audience, how we're designing our utterance, our communication, such that the audience can interact with it appropriately, effectively, and potentially in a transformative fashion, right? And that's an old-fashioned rhetorical principle, i.e. understand your audience, right? But I do think under the sign of design, we do so much already in the humanities that has enormous value and enormous impact. And if we think in those terms, it can help us understand not only our scholarly utterance, but also our audience and how to make that a virtuous cycle between the two. So I would now at this point open up the floor to questions for our panelists. on topics of your concern, questions, etc.
Nothing. Great. Well, I had a great time with all of you.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I'm a law student, and in some of our classes we talk about how the digital age has affected being a lawyer. So now there's so much information out there. Your client can essentially Google their issue and find all this stuff and think they know all this stuff, and then they come to you with an expectation. Well, I found this, so this is right. So as attorneys, you have to sort of prove yourself and be like, okay, great, that's all out there, but we have skills to be able to analyze this and get what we essentially want out of this. So as scholars, so your audience has all this access to all these different articles and all this information that they might not have had before. So how has that impacted you and how you write and ideas that you come up with?
It's impacted especially how I teach, right? Because there were many of the things I taught 15 years ago, before wide access to the web or much information on the web, that it would have been very hard for my students to gather that basic information for an intro class in any form but me delivering it to them in some mode, right? And now, with a creative assignment, they could find and synthesize that information for themselves in a way that probably means they'll retain it better than me delivering it in the more traditional formats I might have delivered it in the past. So as an example, I teach a novel, a cyberpunk novel called Diamond Age, in a class on technology and learning. And the very first time I taught that novel at MIT when the web had just happened, I gave a lecture about that novel and the kind of genre of an English department, about the author, about the genre, about the characters, about its themes. Now in that technology and learning class, I give my students a class to work collaboratively to get as close as they could to producing in 2 hours the introductory lecture I might have given 15 years ago. That's also the theme of the book, how learning needs to change, right? And they probably produce a better intro lecture in 2 hours collaboratively than I produced with 3 weeks of work 15 years ago on that same novel, right? And that, so what's a function of education? Jim was asking this in his first comment, right? Now that so much information is available to our students, I see my role much more as helping to guide them to good information and critical synthesis strategies rather than to provide the information to them. Wikipedia is already better than most introductory lectures, in some ways, right, for just the content. So I don't think we should teach large lecture classes anymore. I think it's really unethical, but it's financially profitable. So, it's...
And how you assess the quality of information is largely dependent on the situation, right? So if if I have cold symptoms or something and I'm going to go and try to figure out what's wrong with me, which I don't recommend, by the way, don't ever do that, on the internet, there's a certain process I think you go through for evaluating whether the information you're getting, is this from WebMD, is this from the Mayo Clinic, right? These people who have an ethos, a credibility that culturally has already been proven to us that we're comfortable with. But it's going to change, right? And so I would imagine that in a legal context, the rubric you would want to use to assess the quality of the information you're finding online is going to be specific to, well, is this, am I looking at Indiana laws, or is this in a different state? Is this from a legal counsel? Are they trying to get me to go with them, or is this a nonprofit? Like there are a lot of factors that you could take into consideration, which is part of why I think media literacy is so important, is that's you define what you value based on a certain context, and use that to assess how useful, I guess, the material is going to be.
I have a question for Tim. What are some of the hot button legal issues that you see now that are relevant to this topic? What are some of the court cases you're watching or areas of controversy that you see?
Yeah, I think fair use is the one that's really on the front burner right now. And as I've had a chance to talk to a lot of people in the audience about the topic, one of the reasons why it stays on the front burner is that we still haven't gotten a lot of definitive precedential decisions yet. You know, it's one of the things we learn as lawyers. There's a hierarchy of precedent, and to get a good district court ruling, a good trial court ruling is nice, and it points to a possible outcome, but it doesn't necessarily point to definitive ruling on something, because that's what appeals courts are for, all the way up to the Supreme Court. And so from that standpoint, I'd say that fair use in a number of cases, the Hobby Trust cases, the Georgia State cases, fair use has gotten a really good showing at the trial court level, and we really need to wait to see whether or not the circuit courts, and maybe someday does the Supreme Court rule in and say, yeah, fair use is alive and well and thriving. And that's what I'm looking forward to right now. So that's what I'm watching right now, because I think it has such a great impact on almost all that we do. Because ultimately, it's not just about that specific ruling. It can take the Google cases, and we can take that argument to other places and say, I've transformed something in a way that I'm not just relaying information, I'm indexing and pointing to information in a way that the Google cases said. Now I can take that in other places. So I'm looking forward to a little bit more robust treatment of fair use.
And there's also some really interesting legislative pathways toward fair use. So documentary filmmakers and film scholars work together with the American University Legal Clinic to instantiate into law legislatively through Congress fair use for film clips for scholars and teaching purposes. And so that, set into precedent of law the ability for me as a film scholar to use film clips as part of fair use. And a huge consortium of art historians, led right now by the College Art Association, are doing similar undertakings and hearings right now with Pat Offerheide, who led the cinema charge, to try to pass legislation around the fair use of images for scholars. And that kind of policy making is important.
It is, but part of the problem then too is also this is another thing we pay attention to. It's the relationship between statutory law and regulation. And this is one place where you should turn that off right now. In my own opinion, I think the regulations that came around copyright law actually hamstrung the use of film clips in a way that there was a very expansive argument to be made on the basis of what you could do under the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, that on these 5-year cycles as the regulations are revisited, I think there were some unnecessary restrictions thrown into this last batch that I think tie our hands a bit.
But that
So
was separate from what was done for film scholars, right? That was a different,
No, that is the film scholar piece.
right underneath it.
Yeah, and it's still allowed, but it's how you get there. So, for
Right.
instance, the use of technologies that would allow you to
Rip.
get around
Yeah.
get around digital rights management,
Yeah.
because that's an exception to the digital rights
Right.
management, and unfortunately, the rules that they put in place, I think, went beyond what they had to do and created very restrictive rules. So that's me. That's not a legal opinion on the. That's my own personal opinion.
Well, we're just going to pretend you didn't tell us about that.
Well, if you get fired, you come to USC.
Oh, that's right. He's provost.
John. Great, that was great, thank you. So if just ask the projection question. In 30 years, what is sort of scholarly publishing going to look like? And then, as a kind of narrowing, is it possible that it could look like the sort of edX consortia program? You have one platform, hopefully it's scalar, and you have all of these different universities that publish using this platform in a sort of sustainable and open fashion. I mean, is that feasible, or does anyone else have any ideas?
Well, I think this is more my vision, right? Not something, but you do see trends right now. I think there's a library publishing coalition and work in place. So there are more university press and library sort of merger happening elsewhere, like Purdue and other places. And I do think the academy is looking at how we actually looking at a mechanism to disseminate and distribute scholarship by ways of the university can do, right? So if I look at 30 years, probably too far. 5 to 10 years, I think we need to more promote the openness of publication and reinvest the dollars or the budget we're putting into licensing and seek maybe if that's opportunity cost for the university and think about what the other alternative publishing model the university can offer and to really advance our scholarship, right? So to give you an example, there are a variety of open journal softwares available. So I'm not sure we want to unify on those, but those actually really give you a very low threshold entry into the publishing business, right? So it's really a matter of networking, getting the right people on the review panel, getting the right people, sending in their content for review, and helping our academy to changing the tenure and promotion game, and giving more weight on those openly published content. I think that's where I see the vision. I think it's happening. So I think 10 years down the road probably will be more accepted by our scholars in general. That's my take on it.
My question actually is for Jim. You seem like a very progressive chairperson who kind of sees the bigger picture, looking ahead about how digital scholarship may change. You mentioned, an example of your junior faculty person. What are the expectations, if any? I'm just talking about the College of Arts and Letters. For faculty to get involved in digital humanities, or whether you're a junior faculty or a tenured faculty, is there an expectation from the dean? You don't have to talk on his behalf, but in your opinion, how many of your colleagues might be approaching this? How many, you and Elliott, I think are front runners, as well as Erin, in terms of incorporating digital projects and really collaborating with students who are almost, some of them are ahead of some faculty members in terms of this realm.
Well, that's a great question. I just had a question with my colleagues. I had a conversation with my colleagues about this morning because we were speculating about how many people on campus are really thinking about this and thinking about digital culture and thinking about how that will change our scholarship and that kind of thing. And to get back to, Tara asked the question yesterday, how many of you are librarians and how many of you are practicing?
Yeah, how many
academics?
faculty are here?
Yeah.
That kind of answers your question.
Because I think there's a lot of nervousness about it for the very reasons I laid out before. In terms, though, of I think the unfortunate thing is that a lot of people who are not working anywhere near 21st century culture, let's say, think of things digital simply as a new delivery system, which might get you greater visibility, but isn't really going to count that much for tenure. So there's a kind of hesitant to move in that direction. In terms of people that are very interested in 21st century culture, there's a fascination, I think, with the digital as something which is new and sexy, but without the kind of critical digital literacy that we've been talking about. All right, and so for me, that's a huge piece of it in terms of my own. Because I was trained in French film theory a long time ago, so I'm just sort of theoretically decided for the rest of my life. But I mean, the point is that it seems to me that there has to be change across the board, not just in terms of credentialing, but getting a kind of meta conversation going about how is this going to impact learning, whether you're writing about Renaissance poetry or you're writing about Quentin Tarantino. And that, I think, that many people here who are practicing scholars, because they don't really know if this is something that speaks to them.
And I think it's not different than the emergence of any other kind of field or methodology, that on any given campus, there'll be a few people who maybe do that, but your intellectual community is probably not going to be from the peers in your department, but from the scattered like-minded people in other universities around the country. Like, I mean, I'm not sure if it's true, but I think if yesterday I had been giving a talk on, kind of feminism and algorithms, or feminism and film, my colleagues from the film department probably would have been there to hear the talk, because that would have registered to their platforms. I'm not going to use that, who cares, right? So there's not, I don't think it's necessarily that every university should have, compel scholars to do digital humanities work in the arts and humanities, but that universities shouldn't penalize people for doing it, right? Like how you kind of create a pathway that allows multiple approaches. Right?
So my question has to do with pedagogy. So we've spoken a lot about research and open access and those kind of things. I'm kind of curious as to what the panel thinks in relation to online teaching, open access, intellectual property, relationships between online courses and institutional repositories, and so forth. So it's just a general kind of, I just want to know what you all guys think about it, like what you see the futures of and how it relates back to kind of the issues that we talked about to do with open access and so forth.
I mean, generally, I think online teaching needs to happen, right? Just if you see the numbers of the people around the globe who don't have access to higher education, I think it's important that we multiply the ways people access knowledge. So I'm not against, MOOCs. I think their hype has sort of so drowned out their potential that it's hard to define the kernel of what might be useful in there. But I think the more what we might call learning objects we have available, open access and repositories, those might be straight up video lectures, they might be, digital worksheets, they might be open scholarship, and systems that help learners access those across a lifetime, the better off the world is, right? I tend to favor edX over some of the other options, but I don't think any of those will probably persist for 10 years. To go back to Eric.
Anat was just here, so let's pretend.
Yeah. Well, I heard John Palfrey, who was the Harvard Berkman kind of guy, right, and the chair of the Digital Public Library. We were both keynotes in an event at Millbury a couple of weeks ago, and he very firmly, publicly came down for edX versus your other options, right? If you're going to split the evils, here's the one to go with, right? But I think it's still, yeah. We should have online learning. We've had it for 50 years, right? So it should persist in even more inventive ways. But I don't think we should do it for profit any more than Elsevier should be selling our scholarship for profit.
I mean, I work at several universities. If you're talking about really helping students to achieving in their lives, right? So every year we turn away so many students because we have this size of classrooms, and we probably admit more students, maybe 5-10%, and that's it. Every 4 years we enroll about 9,000 students, undergraduate, or 25,000, depending on the size of the university. So really talking about the mission of the university, I do support online learning because that really changing the admission game differently, right? So again, back to the online catalog, the course catalog. So if we do more online teaching, and students they don't have to come to or living on the campus all the time. They can come to the campus for 2 weeks, and talking to their professors and talking to their peers, and that way they can go back to their own home and continue to learn at their own pace. It may take me 4 months to understand the film theories, right? But it may take me 2 months to understand the laws, right? So I think people they're built differently, the way they learn differently. So if you're really moving online, I do think taking our Notre Dame for example, I think we can actually enroll probably 4 times to 5 times more students into the university and start teaching them about the social justice, the values we deeply rooted in our scholarship. And I think it's really an opportunity for us. From the library point of view, yesterday, Sonia, we talked about preserving the open course software content. You couldn't even find where they are, right? Doesn't matter edX exists 10 years after or what, but I think the library needs to start taking over the preservation, make sure the records are in place. So once we have this repository of content in place, doesn't matter the platform change or not, we can reuse the content. We can analyze it, the past courses, and we probably will getting our education better over time.
I think the risk is that model piggybacks on increasing economic inequality in the US and other countries, so that you have online learning and then you have privileged face-to-face wood-paneled room learning, and that second kind of learning is only available to the very wealthy, and online learning with all its kind of fraught peril is open for the masses. I think we have to work really hard that that's not the system we default to, and I think that is the default if we don't make sure that online education doesn't become the holding pin for all the people who can't come to Notre Dame, right? So.
There's something to be said about the value proposition of efficacy, right? So there are ways in which online courses can be more effective for certain kind of subject matters and for certain kinds of learners than a face-to-face course, whether it's taught in an elite institution or otherwise, right? And so I think that you're right about exaggerating the digital divide. I mean, the elite and then the many. I mean, that's a really serious point. But I think if we do this right, we can get better efficacy, more effective learning, et cetera, in all the sectors, because we're being more intentional and proposing about the tools we put in place and the structures we put in place to help learners at different paces and so on. So
And particularly what we've learned about student debt in the last couple of years, there's all the more reason to maybe, think about thoughtful, just online education.
So I had Erin, right? You had mentioned gatekeeper a few times. It sounds like a very common thread underpinning this is going from gatekeeping to networks of trust. And I don't know, what are some steps that you're taking and how you're trying to shift conversations with your dean, with us, I guess. I don't know. But yeah, how that's happening, as a model for people to proceed and try to take action on this democratization of knowledge and scholarly work.
For me, it means having spent a lot of time over the last 7 years of talking to people outside of my tribe. So we're constantly and endlessly, kind of like the last 2 days, right? Normally what a scholar does is go and talk to people who are like them, right? And I think what we need now are scholars, librarians, publishers, technologists, designers, talking to each other in ways that we collectively imagine how those gates come down and the trust goes up, right? And I think if we each stay in our little silo, that's much less likely to happen in a way that benefits everybody, right? So.
That was absolutely true for us, which Lori's not here anymore, but when the writing program wanted to change our journal from print-based to web-based, and we have no budget, right? We do not have the technical in-house expertise to make this happen, right? And so figuring out who your allies are, we can't work with the publisher really anymore in a way that's satisfying to us to make this web-based environment, so we have to do it in-house. We can't do it in the writing program, so finding your people outside of your tribe, and since Hesburgh is exploring this, maybe the library can be a site of digital publishing, that was a great opportunity to collaborate and find that network. Here's, now we have a new tribe, a wider tribe, of people who are invested, they're stakeholders in the project for different reasons. But it's shifted the power dynamic. It's no longer the publisher says this, and here are all the rules, and we kind of give them the content to pour into this framework that they've given to us. Now we're collaboratively coming up with the framework ourselves based on our shared set of values, which I think is pretty exciting.
this, the new technological media have given rise in some ways to new scholarship or new forms of scholarship. And I think as libraries, we struggle in several ways with this. The most obvious is capturing it and retaining it, which I mean, I think we touched upon a bit. Another one that I'll just toss out to the panel is, I mean, libraries have not only been repositories in that sense for books that we have around us or electronic type things, but also that places that organize knowledge in a way. I mean, the Dewey Decimal System, the Library of Congress system is divided up to organize knowledge in some ways. How do these new forms of scholarship that that you do in some ways and that many others are doing and might come down the line, how do they fit into our conventional, or if you want, traditional kind of organization of knowledge?
I think in some ways they really destabilize it, but I'm not sure that's entirely a bad thing. Like one of the things I've learned spending a lot of time lately with archivists and librarians is a scholar, I thought those were the same thing, and you quickly learn when you step into a different community that typically archivists and librarians are not the same thing, right? And, historically the function of the archive was to protect and conserve. You put on your white gloves and you went in and delicately touched the objects, right? I love Rick Prelinger and his sort of notion of radical archiving, that, an archive is justified by its use. And if the archive is justified by its use, that probably means some of your classification is going to be more porous and not as fixed, right? And those classification systems were created often to classify things in a singular, to locate them in a singular place. But when they're digital and can live in many places, your classification and ordering has to be multiple as well. So. And Foucault told us that, before we had the web, but now we could actually make it happen.
I think we are, last questions. Anyone, one last taker for a question? We're probably a little bit over the time we've allotted. But with that, let me close and let's thank our panel for this great conversation.